Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was written by PistilWhip. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about buying boots, min-maxing your boot buying strategies. PistilWhip begins, Discworld author Terry Pratchett has an evocative example in the character Vimes, musing on how expensive it is to be poor. It begins, the reason that the rich were so rich, Vimes reasoned, was because they managed to spend less money. Take boots, for example. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that'd still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while a poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. PistilWhip continues, I often encounter this in upgrade-driven games, where I specifically avoid short-term purchases in favor of saving up for a stronger, more expensive item. Why spend money now on an item that I will soon replace, is my reasoning. I consider myself to be on the expensive boots side of the shoe store in that regard. No specific talking points for this discussion. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on boot stores you may have perused in the past, literally or figuratively. Some added trivia, the Terry Pratchett estate allowed the use of Vimes' name for the Vimes Boots Index, a price index for measuring the cost of the cheapest staple foods. Cool. This is a fun idea for a parlay. So the idea you've summarized pretty well. There is this tension that may correlate with people who enjoy making build decisions, where you kind of start min-maxing when you even make a build decision to some extent. And it doesn't have to be in games where there's really much of a decision point. This decision point is a little different. It's often just, do I upgrade or not? And then there might separately be, what do I upgrade to? But that's interesting. And so I would predict that people that are interested in making those choices generally might trend toward avoiding the choice when it doesn't seem efficient. That is, if you like meaningful choices, you'll avoid upgrading when it isn't a meaningful upgrade. I think it's worth briefly adding to the Vimes example. A lot of people might be bouncing off the idea that defines rich people. Maybe it's better to replace rich there with middle class. The middle class person can buy the more efficient thing and not have to replace a really cheap thing that was all they could get at the time. You get the better value that way. In first world countries media, rich people are often correlated with buying ludicrously inefficiently expensive versions of things where you could have upgraded the by far best efficiency kind of middle breakpoint on like 20 subjects for the price of this one over expensive gadget version of something. I'm sure you can all think of your own examples of these absurd expense purchases. But again, maybe it's just better to replace rich with middle class there in our, probably your, but certainly my cultural context. Otherwise, yeah, there's not much to add. So what I'm going to do in this parlay is just give you a few examples from my own experience, and then talk about it in video games, where I think PistilWhip has correctly hit on the idea that that makes it a bit more interesting. It's often, as I was saying before, I think pretty simple in most other areas of life. The middle option is by far the best kind of break point. You get to the point where you're getting almost all of the benefit for much less than what would be the maximum price. Because you quickly gain a lot of quality of life if you invest a bit more. And also you get that thing where the thing doesn't break. There's a sort of like low end value point where your device will break so much sooner that you won't gain money even for a lower quality thing. You'll still have wet feet. You get to the point at that mid break point where you get the job done relatively permanently, but also gain most of the value you would have gotten for going 10 times higher in price. You get diminishing returns, you might say. So I'll give you two examples of my own. We'll get into video game stuff. The examples I'm going to use are microphones and webcams, well, sort of. A thing I think is interesting about doing video production is that the way that you upgrade path can be very different for audio versus video. First of all, there's some discussion about which one is more important, or how you would value each of the options. You know, to some extent, video can be seen as more important because it might add necessary clarity to the thing that you're doing, but my experience is that the floor for good video is pretty high nowadays. That is, you can make your video have good enough quality that there's no real benefit to having higher quality, unless you're literally talking about graphics specifically, for essentially no investment. If your laptop already has a webcam, or you have a phone that you can tie to your desktop or whatever to use as a webcam, that is irrelevantly high quality for most use cases. Indeed, I used my phone, just my smartphone, as a webcam for quite some time, and I have a fairly low end smartphone. Not an $1,000 iPhone, more like a $200. You go manually buy it instead of going to the phone store and getting whatever expensive thing they upsell you, rando, Pixel or something. That I don't really recommend, but it was a pretty good, I get the benefits of a smartphone without paying a lot of money for features I just don't need. I can run the games that don't run well on it because it's laggy on my computer using an emulator. If I want to use a good camera, well, everybody else I've ever met has a better smartphone camera, so it's not a big deal. In the few times I feel like I've noticed a loss in quality, there was someone else there who had a 5 times more expensive iPhone. Indeed, it actually still has pretty good cameras, my cheapo one that I have. It is $200, so I guess it should, right? Anyway, so webcams, there's this kind of phenomenon where you've arguably already hit the breakpoint before you even start, and you would need a very advanced upgrade for you to actually gain much, but you do gain quality of life. Were you to use your phone as a webcam, were I to use my phone as this webcam right now, it would be tied to my computer all the time. I did actually do a little thing. Does this count as sort of min-maxing an upgrade? So some of the devices, here I have it on a key light. I have these magnetic charging, they look like little nipples or something. These little magnetic charging guys. Let me see if I can take it out for you. Yeah. And these allow you to put a charging cable. They won't transfer data, though I wonder if you could get a more expensive one that would. But they'll allow you to charge a device using a charging cable that has that kind of magnetic port on it. The idea is that you gain the seemingly small benefit of not needing to plug it in when you take it off. If you had a webcam hanging up here, where my webcam currently is, that was your smartphone, you don't have to yank it, unplug it, shake everything to get it off. You can just lift it away and the cable will simply come off. This allows you to much more seamlessly unplug and plug in objects that you're using. And of course, over time, it may reduce wear on your device as you shove stuff into it. I don't think that's a huge deal. But for some use cases, this is pretty nice. It allows things to feel a little more modular if that's useful to you. And when I used my smartphone as a webcam, I did use these. That was originally why I found these. So I didn't have to worry about that. And I got to do the gimmick, and it was a gimmick, and I stopped doing it, of moving around the webcam seamlessly, just being able to pick this up and move with it. I will probably use that technique in the future for some other different purpose, because I think that's cool and valuable. And these are $5 is obviously where this is going. It's not expensive. That gives you some modularity back. A good amount of the quality of life. Your phone is kind of, in a meaningful way, doesn't feel like it's tied to your computer for essentially zero money compared to buying a webcam that would have the same quality camera as your phone. Right now, I use a $50 range webcam, and the primary benefit is that it was on sale for even cheaper than that, and it just lets me not have my phone be tied to the thing. The software I was using became kind of annoying to deal with, but it wasn't a big upgrade. I don't think I'd be willing to pay for that. Now, there are upgrades to be had. You could have a webcam. A viewer recommended this, which I think is a cool idea, a webcam that kind of tracks your head as you move. I do a good amount of hand talking and hand moving as I speak, but I'm kind of trying to stop doing that as unintentionally. I do a little more than I intend. And I also think that would be kind of distracting, potentially. There's an element where things become showy instead of a quality of life increase. It sounds good, keep your head in the frame all the time, but it might actually feel kind of excessive. There's a way in which it can remove value to have the fancy option, or you sort of stop appreciating the lower end options for their often merits. We'll get back to that point in a little bit. Now, microphones, on the other hand, there's a pretty clear upgrade path, pretty satisfying example here. You have options like the Blue Yeti. This is a pretty well-known microphone for making videos. Now, this has a preamp inside of it. You've got a microphone and then something that amplifies that signal. It pre-amplifies the signal before it gets to your device, computer in this case. And a Blue Yeti and some other Blue brand microphones, USB microphones if you like, well, they have preamps built into them. Now, they're heavy, because the preamp part adds weight. and hanging the microphone over your setup with 15 devices plugged in and multiple screens, I do not want it to be heavy. As you might imagine, I want to buy a cheaper microphone arm by a lot that won't be bulky and in the way. So I'm willing to pay more to upgrade to a microphone that is lighter and more modular, but actually isn't all that much better quality. And the great thing about this upgrade point is often the break point is modularity. It's not actually much better quality. It's sort of like you've permanently solved this issue. I mean, this is an XLR microphone that I'm using currently. That technology's been around for like twice as long as I've been alive, maybe. It's probably never going to break unless I like throw it at something. And it's a microphone, a cable leading to a preamp with another slot to plug in another microphone, controls on the preamp to some extent, and then a cable that plugs into my computer. Each part can now be independently replaced. I can manage the weight and the different chunks of it wherever I want. It kind of solves that problem a little bit permanently in a way that the Blue Yeti, I would need a very specific setup that would immediately change if I changed anything. And it's extremely heavy. It's not very versatile if I need to put it up somewhere high. I might need to invest almost as much as in the better microphone setup just to get it to be where I want it to be, which that doesn't feel that good. So again, a case where I would argue it's almost better to consider not even having the microphone. There's an additional dimension here just because we're adding detail to the min-maxing, where your audience, if you are a new creator, will notice more if the upgrade is bigger. So I think there's a bias, and maybe not a bad one, to go for larger, more noticeable upgrades because it's kind of easier to see the story of the channel progressing if those things are that way. I mean, I also think that for most people that are capable of eating the time loss of streaming, kind of the logistical difficulty of streaming or making videos, you kind of need to keep doing it consistently for a while. It's hard for me to imagine that all that many people that can do that, that have the privilege to be able to do that, can't afford like what is basically the breakpoint, where an audience member will not likely be able to hear the benefit if you were to get a better mic. And the webcam, you could argue there's almost no breakpoint. You're quite likely to just have a webcam of irrelevantly high quality already. And then the other major expenses would be buying lights and soundproofing foam. You could probably get that setup done for less than $100 total for, again, an irrelevantly good solution. You don't really need anything better. Now, you might notice if a professional lighting technician for several $1,000s audited your setup and bought you more expensive lights, but it would cost like 15 to 20 times as much, make your space much harder to live in if you live in an apartment and you have your room / studio and then a living space, and that's all the space you have. Is that really worth it? You see what I mean? You would get a benefit, but you would also get a negative on top of it. There would be a detriment attached. So I don't know. The other thing is you hit a break point with these kind of midpoint purchases where the thing is cheap enough that it's not a disaster if it breaks, but it's expensive enough that you do get the quality. So that's also another benefit. If you buy a very expensive thing, you can get blown out if something doesn't work or you want to make a different decision, and you also get that benefit if you go for the middle option. So indeed, I think with physical objects, this isn't a very interesting decision. If you buy anything other than the mid-tier one, it's essentially just a mistake. There's really almost no benefit to buying any of the other options. I did actually want to quickly highlight something that I think is interesting about having a lower end option, though. There's just a couple of topics as a little middle thing here. I just think this is interesting. It's not really that related to what you were saying. The idea, in my mind, is that one, it's kind of valuable and interesting to have the lower end thing as a comparison point. For example, I've been asked several times in my career what a lower end setup would be like, or what an entry level setup would be like, and I could demonstrate it if I had a mic that sounded noticeably worse, which I guess I probably do somewhere. The Blue Yeti still sounds fine, but is inconvenient. I can kind of demonstrate that. I may have demonstrated that in the past. Another example would be something like I own a coffee grinder that is a pretty nice tier below the coffee grinder that I currently use, so that can be kind of interesting to compare. It's actually not a huge bump up. It's more of a style and convenience difference there. That's already at the point where $150 gets you an electric coffee burr grinder that is of I think, sufficient quality for anybody but an enthusiast, as long as you're not making espresso. But those are qualifications. You are buying a burr grinder for coffee. Are you not an enthusiast at that point? Kind of depends what you mean by enthusiast. Which leads me to a second point. The cheap purchase is often used as a way to find out if you want to make the more expensive purchase, which I think is a bad idea. You often spend about half of the money just to find out that you want to spend another half that much money. Could you not have just made the thing half the price and bought it? When I put it that way, it sounds like what the heck, you did in a capitalism to yourself. If you buy an $150 coffee grinder to find out if you want the $300 coffee grinder, you essentially just changed the price of the $300 coffee grinder from almost like it was $150 to almost like it was $450. You do have two coffee grinders if you go that route, and that could have merit. The next person in your life that wants to get the entry-level one, well, you can give it to them. That's another benefit. There might be benefits to comparing them. There may be benefits to having two sometimes, using two yourself. Microphones, you can think of situations where perhaps you would want to have multiple. Webcams, multiple might be useful. And it's often sufficient for the other one to be at a lower quality. If a lot of the benefit is that it might break sooner, well, if you use it much less, then that might be okay. But a lot of the time, I think that to some extent, you've made the mid-tier option kind of ruined as a value proposition. You sort of made it a worse breakpoint. There are sometimes merits. Again, I don't really regret these purchases I've mentioned. I think it made sense getting a Blue Yeti. I mean, I used it for a number of years, and I didn't know what my setup was going to be like or know what I wanted. It would have been bad to buy something more expensive, but I didn't know what I wanted. It can be important to buy the cheap one to find the problems that the better upgrade will solve. You don't know what problem you'd want to solve by upgrading, and so you need the cheaper one. But yeah, I don't know. For the most part, I think it's not always that good. Another example I can think of is that sometimes people kind of get themselves in a position where it feels like there's they want to do the thing, so they're willing to do it at any price point, but it's arguably not worth it without paying more money. Like going on a vacation, when you really don't have the budget to enjoy going on a vacation, I think it's very arguably better to just not go on the vacation. But a lot of people exhibit a behavior where they decide to do the thing before investigating the breakpoint, when often my experience is the breakpoint determines whether I'm interested in doing the thing. Generally, if you're not there, I have a pretty high threshold where I say, well, this just isn't worth it until you're willing to invest this much. Not necessarily money, it might be time as well. Is it really worth trying Path of Exile if you only have 15 minutes every day to play it? You might then, a lot of people say no, is all I'll say. I don't know, actually. I feel like you could make that work. That's a weird example, but I think you get it. Anyway, I just think that's interesting. Let's move on to some game examples. I think it's interesting to have talked about some non-gaming examples first, because games have a lot of different parameters on them. First of all, it's not money you're spending. It kind of changes the equation a little bit, because you don't have a kind of objective societal limiter, if you're not rather wealthy, that is determining where you can make the decisions. There's something different determining that decision making. Generally, time. And a lot of time, I think it's fear or kind of doubt. I'll explain what I mean. So PistilWhip, you defined yourself as being someone who generally goes to the expensive boots side of the shoe store. You would rather make the least upgrades that have the most impact. Now, I have a sort of tension. Generally, I would say I'm not that type of player. I generally spend currencies and consumables I have in games. I associate it as being a place where that makes sense to do. They're not real money, and generally there's this problem where I get value, possibly fun, out of them now, if I use them now, whereas in the future there are many ways in which the game may remove their value. There's a sort of inflation in many games' mechanics. For example, maybe the game makes a resource rather limited, but through some circumstance or another, it becomes unlimited later. I can only buy a certain number of upgrade stones or whatever. At this point in the game, but possibly unbeknownst to me, I will be able to buy as many as I want later. Slash, if I save them too much, I will have a surplus, and then when I do want to use them, I won't need that many. You know, I get 10 upgrade stones, and you can max out a weapon at 5. By the time I have 15, I don't want to max out 3 weapons, so the 5 that I didn't spend earlier are wasted. Something like that. I end up getting a point of excess at which you kind of lose some at a certain point of excess. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because a lot of people have a tendency to go for having a buffer of resources. They want to have a sort of minimum amount that they never spend. But a paradox that occurs here is that if you never spend them, then you are guaranteeing absolutely for sure that you lose that many because you're not going to spend them. I find it necessary to set some parameter upon which I will spend that resource. Some maybe challenging parameter. It's valuable to have the buffer there. When you want to use it, it's good to have it. So having there be multiple tiers where you spend things seems good. You could argue this is kind of like breakpoints. If there's a boss that you want to kill, and you can throw a consumable at the boss to finish them off, well, making sure you literally always have that consumable seems really good. That way you never have the experience of just barely losing to a boss. They had 1 HP, but you just couldn't finish them off or something. If that feels really bad, maybe it's good to save a throwable so that you're never ever in that situation. At the same time, you have permanently deducted that resource from your account if you do that. And so picking a situation under which you will throw it, no matter what, when the boss is at basically 1 health, seems like a good system. That seems like a good way of sort of saving an item for people that don't use potions and stuff in games. But I use them a lot. Again, there's a tension where you're not sure if the thing is going to be a good investment or how plentiful that upgrade point is. I want to spend my upgrade stones, but maybe they're very limited, particularly if the thing is a build upgrade component. I have no way of knowing much of the time if I'm going to be given enough of them to upgrade everything all the way or not. Will I not have enough to upgrade all the way? So there's a hesitancy in my normally trigger-happy spending where I'm wondering, will I become permanently unable to upgrade everything all the way? Should I spend this now? And generally my solution is just that it becomes multi-tiered. So for example, maybe I'll spend some. I'm probably not going to have so few that I can't upgrade even some of the things I want, right? So, you know, in a game with a build system, my rule is usually the game is going to let you upgrade one thing all the way. The games generally won't design themselves in a way where they won't do that. The player the least invested in the game, the developer least interested in designing decision points, is probably still going to let you upgrade one thing all the way. So go ahead and pick one thing. There's really no need to hesitate there. And the decisions probably wouldn't be meaningful unless you could upgrade one other thing. For example, if you can switch between these things, but you can only upgrade one of them literally at all if you invest all of the upgrades into it, there's arguably no reason to even allow the player to acquire the other ones. So maybe you can go ahead and upgrade at least one more option. The game has given you options. You can assume that you can make a choice. You can upgrade 2, maybe. But then I'll often hold back if I've invested in 2 options. I often think, well, it is possible that the game won't let me upgrade everything all the way. You could think of games with stat upgrades as well. Maybe you can max out 1 or 2 stats, but not all 6, let's say. And so go ahead and max 1 or 2 out. There should be no reason not to do that most of the time. But maybe not all the way in all of them, especially if you can't respec. That's another thing. What is the value of having the cheaper one? I mentioned before that another way you can efficiently use these kind of breakpoints when you invest in something is if you're going up the chain, then maybe getting something that could feasibly be useful later, like it is less powerful overall, but it has a niche, is really good. Items which give me an ability I did not have before, but at a very small magnitude, tend to be attractive to me as options. For example, in a game with no health regen, having an infinitely small amount of health regen is likely going to be pretty useful because it means that I can just do nothing in AFK and regen my entire health bar at any point. I gained the ability to heal for no resource cost by owning that item. If there aren't other healing regen items available that regen fast enough for it to be practical in combat, they arguably don't do anything compared to the cheaper option. They won't make much of a difference, you could argue. On the other hand, there may be examples where regenerating my stamina, let's say, isn't useful unless that regeneration is fast enough that I can make an additional attack while attacking enemies. So I'm not willing to buy in until it's above a certain magnitude, and I would then want to upgrade only once it's a good few steps up and I can actually notice, again, get in yet another attack before running out of stamina. You could argue these are those breakpoints from before. The game may have kind of decided where those breakpoints are, whereas with something like my coffee grinder example or the microphone example, it's quite subjective exactly where that breakpoint is. You know, what XLR microphone is high enough quality that a layperson won't be able to tell the difference. There isn't an answer to that question, although you could interview people and average it out, although you cannot interview people and average it out. You personally can't do that, but theoretically one could. An industry may claim such a thing, but then they have a bias and a motivation, don't they? The coffee tasting thing. Well, it's pretty difficult to objectify where that breakpoint is. You can kind of look at what's on the market, sort of. You know, an example that happened for me is I wanted a flat burr grinder said to give a different flavor character than conical burr grinders, and having one of those that is quiet, that auto offs, and which fits the capacity or like is designed for the type of use that I'm using, that just wasn't havable at below a certain price point, and that price point was medium enough that I thought, well, I don't know if I even want to spend more than that lowest amount, and it does get me the things I wanted, so let's go for that. And indeed, I think that is an excellent grinder to choose. By the way, the Wilfa uniform is the grinder I'm referring to. Just as an example. So I do think to some extent the breakpoint is sort of objective to by process of elimination, even though the quality that you're upgrading seems to be subjective. It just, if you set certain parameters, there will be no options except this one, or it literally doesn't allow you to do an extra attack until you get more stamina, something like that. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, overall, I would say my shtick in games is that I like to upgrade because I think it's generally fun to use up the resources you have, but I hate grinding for resources, and it feels really good to make a great upgrade. So that's in tension for me with spending resources. I'm definitely prone to some analysis paralysis, but because my work would not happen if I was too prone to analysis paralysis, I've definitely learned to overcome that to some extent. I think I'm actually pretty good at that. As someone who heavily analyzes things, I believe that in that context, I am very good compared to others at actually making a decision. I'm spend happy even though I've thought about it at great length. I think that is a good quality. I'm, I suppose, proud of that, the way I'm talking about it. Yeah, let's see. I got most points done. Yes, there was one other thing I wanted to say. There's this element of a thing I bring up often in Parley about how people who like or dislike a thing are often not thinking of the same thing as the other side. I constantly overuse this example in coffee. People who dislike coffee often mistakenly believe that people who say they like the coffee that they dislike, when in fact they're referring to different coffee. The people who like coffee agree that that coffee is bad, but they like other good coffee that exists. And you could argue that coffee is somewhat objectively good, that other coffee is somewhat objectively bad. The example in a game might be, you know, people playing a playstyle often don't see the merit of a playstyle they haven't tried, and then when they try it a little bit, it doesn't seem that good. But of course it doesn't seem that good, because they're not in to that playstyle the way that the person who likes it is. They're going deeper on it. If you just try something a little bit, it feels like you can say you tried and therefore you don't have to wonder anymore. But this is cheating yourself of actually discovering if the thing is something you'd like. You generally need to have the good version before there's any meaning to evaluating it. So the takeaway for this subject for me is that when you own a cheap thing, I think it's generally good to treat yourself as if you know nothing about that subject. If you have a coffee grinder, but it's a cheap coffee grinder, you do not know anything about coffee grinders. If you have a microphone, but it's a cheap microphone, you don't really know anything about microphones. You may value the more expensive one. Your feelings about the cheap one shouldn't prevent you from wondering if the expensive one is good, I argue, because often there's a break point where the expensive option does a thing the cheap one doesn't. It's not just more of the same, the quantity becomes quality. It gets to a point where the coffee tastes good enough that the harshness gets out of the way and you taste what is good. There's a phenomenon in chocolate grinding. Our tongues can't taste, kind of feel, I guess, particles below a certain size. So chocolate mills use stones to grind little pieces of cacao with the cocoa fat in them into a finer and finer grain. At some point, you taste it and it tastes grainy. You grind it for one more instant and suddenly it tastes totally smooth because your taste buds cannot perceive below that threshold. The quantity became quality from your subjective perspective. And I think this is true of upgrading things as well. Sometimes it feels like, or people act like, oh, boots are something you always have to upgrade. But that stops being true if you buy above a certain threshold. You see what I mean? Even though all that happened was the thing got a little better, a little better, a little better, it transformed the actual function of the thing at a certain amount of good. I think that's a big point of this sort of like breakpoint analysis that happens here. So generally, I think it's a good idea to not pass judgment on something unless you've gone rather deep into it, which is frustrating because you want to try things and have that actually be useful information. Personally, since this is getting pretty off topic, in my opinion, I feel like it's worth giving the brief piece of advice that it can be more helpful to think about the experience of doing the thing. For example, let's say you were to want to make a YouTube channel. If you do it a little bit and you feel one way or another, the problem is you won't know how you feel when you've been doing it all the time or for years or whatever, right? But you could potentially help simulate that by focusing not on how you feel after having done it or about doing it, but how it feels as you are in the middle of it, rather than the prospect of putting all the effort in. The feeling after putting the effort in, maybe not as helpful in my opinion. Maybe it's more helpful to think about the process. How do you feel now while doing it now? Or maybe you want to make chocolate or espresso. Watch some videos about people doing it and think about that process. Try to find a video of it being done in real time and think about whether you want that. Are you enjoying watching it? Do you want to grab something with your hand and give it a try? That might be a better indication that the thing is interesting to you than like technically trying it, but just getting in at the ground floor. Again, some of these things are technical enough that it's just unpleasant to do them without the quality of life. Many of these subjects I'm talking about are literally defined by quality of life. A quick example is that right now I'm spending a lot of my time working, coming up with the way to make or the format for a video, but that really isn't my job. That's just something that needs to be done as kind of R&D for the videos to exist. My job will have essentially nothing to do with doing that as soon as it's done going forward. So I'll be honest with you, I don't enjoy that process, but it doesn't matter. I'm sort of at the bad version of that subject, and it's better to think about, well, when I'm making videos and sharing videos and streaming, well, do I like that? Because that's the thing I'm meant to enjoy, and I do enjoy it. The hard parts are kind of around it when I have to make sure everything is working or it's stressful to get to the point of being successful, but that isn't the thing that I'm meant to enjoy. That's a sort of temporary bit. Again, an example would be you don't enjoy spending money to replace boots or repairing your waterlogged boots, but that's something that would go away once you had the better boots. That doesn't mean you don't like boots. When I put it that way, it sounds obvious. You don't dislike boots if you dislike broken boots, putting it that way. I think that's pretty much all I have to say. I think these are fun. You know, Yasagami, you often remark that these are last-minute parlay or sort of off-the-cuff parlay. But I wanted to say that I think for better or for worse, this is a good format. You know, I say this a lot of parlay. I hope it doesn't come across as me saying, well, I do make money if you keep doing these, so I love this format. I don't say it lightly. I think it's interesting to note that I had at first wondered, when I started doing Parley, if enough people would, I sort of hate to say it this way, but like be good at proposing Parley for Parley to be good as a thing, you know? This series relies a little bit on them being good enough, I guess, that when people who don't buy it watch it, they want to buy it now and again, right? Logically, it is like sort of, I hope, pretty good min-max of quality ad for itself. You get to enjoy a ton of content for free while I still get paid because of the way that things are structured. I think that's good. That's good, right? I don't know. I hope that's friendly. That feels good. And lots of people do watch Parley that don't buy it. So evidently it does provide some value. I think that's a good thing. But it's interesting to me how many seemingly good ways there are to do prompts. Like, people take very different approaches to doing the prompts, and I don't know, y'all are kind of good at writing, I guess. I don't know. They're not, immaculately structured essays or whatever, but a lot of formats work fairly well. And I would like to alleviate myself of a little bit of credit there. You might be tempted to say, well, it's because you're doing a good job. Thanks, I guess. But I often do literally just read the entire prompt as it is and then answer. I mean, the person writing the prompt gets some credit. I don't know. Anyway, I just think it's interesting. Let it be known that the amount of effort does not, as is hopefully known, even remotely correlate with the quality of the result. To some extent, I think it is inspiration. This doesn't have anything to do with the Parley anymore, in my opinion, but I think it's true what they say. The way to make good things is to make a lot of things. Not to obsess over one thing, but to just make a lot of things. I think to some extent people get discouraged by the idea that, you're going to make something bad or whatever unless you focus on it a lot. Or it feels like saying that making a lot of things is the way to make good things makes it feel like a thing is destined for its fate. The idea is good or bad when you have it, even though I think that's often not how ideas develop. But the takeaway for me is that you shouldn't get hung up on whether a thing is good or not if you want to make good things, because you will have good ideas if you have enough ideas. You need to have more ideas, not magically better ideas, at least in my humble experience. But I have heard a lot of people who do creative work consistently say the same thing. You can wait for inspiration to strike, but you would have had more good ideas in that time if you just made something every day. You would just also have a gigantic mountain of mediocre things as well. Another way to think of it is the best way to make a video might be to make a video every day, but then just not publish 6 out of 7 of those and pick the best one on the 7th day and publish that, rather than trying for a week to make one really good video. I would argue that you would make better videos or be more successful if you took 1/7 of the time to make 7 videos and put up one of them. And I think that that's somewhat true of Parley as well. The trick here is kind of that if you make a few of these, you're gonna trigger good thoughts in my head that will be fun to discuss. At least that's why I'm enjoying it. Like, you just hit on things that are fun. I don't know, I just thought that was interesting. These PistilWhip, it's because you keep saying that they're kind of low effort as if that's a bad thing, when I think that's essentially the trick to making fun creative work. So I just wanted to say I think that's good. Thanks for asking for the Parley. It was cool. This was a good topic. Kind of weird, but a good topic.